Good evening. I'm very pleased to be moderating this session. The way it's going to work is that I will introduce Professor Loop, and then he will talk for about 40 minutes. And then there will be a Q&A session that I will moderate. So please, ask your questions. Maybe you can actually ask them on the chat, and then at the end of the talk, Professor Loop will be very happy to try to answer some of them. And so we'll start with Professor Jan Loop, who is a professor of early modern history and religious cultures at the University of Copenhagen. Before that, he was professor of early global history at the University of Kent in the UK. He received his doctorate from the University of Bern in Switzerland. Dr. Loop is the PI in the ERC Synergy Grant Project, which is entitled the European Qur'an. And the project actually benefits from a very large fund to the amount of 10 million euros. And it aims at rewriting the history of the Quran in Christian European culture and religion from medieval times and until the 19th century. He has developed this project during his first stay here at NYU Abu Dhabi as a senior research fellow in 2006-2017. Since then, he has also been involved in developing the initiative entitled Recognizing Religions, the Cultural Dynamics of Religious Encounters and Interactions in Historical Perspective, here again at NYU Abu Dhabi. Professor Loop's work is mainly concerned with intellectual, religious, and cultural encounters in the early modern world, and particularly with the history of Christian-Muslim relations from the Middle Ages to the modern world. Jan has published already 2 monographs, one of them called Auslegungskulturen, sorry for mispronouncing, which means cultures of interpretation, is a comparative study of early modern methods of interpreting the Bible and the Quran. This book was published in 2004. His second book, entitled Johann Heinrich Hottinger, 1620-1667, Arabic and Islamic Studies in the 17th Century, was published in 2013 in the Oxford Warburg Studies series. Currently, Professor Loop is working on a book with the title Uses of the Quran in Protestant Europe, co-authored also with Asaf Bentov, a research associate in the European Qur'an project. Professor Loop, we are all ears to understand more this magnificent project that you are part and parcel of. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for this introduction, and thanks very much for having me here. And I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see it all right. Thanks very much. I'm not going to say much about the context in which this talk I'm giving has been formed. As Nadia said, I'm leading together with colleagues at Madrid, Mercedes Garcia Renal, who is the lead of this project, and Roberto Totoli at Naples, L'Orientale, and John Tolan, this project on the European Quran. I have a team, or I work with a lovely team in Copenhagen, and some of you might know some of the people, and I will also reference some of their work while I'm going through my talk. I would like to start with a few lectures that I found in my hometown in St. Gallen in eastern Switzerland, in the archives of the physician, council member and antiquarian Sebastian Schobinger. These letters are sent from Cairo and Marseille by 2 brothers, Jakob Christoph and Ulrich Krumm. And these seem to be merchants from St. Gallen who have been trading in the Barbary coast in the first half of the 17th century. Jakob Christoph was based in Marseille and Ulrich in Cairo, and they were cousins of this Schobinger. So they sent him letters, and these letters are mainly, as far as I can tell, they're quite difficult to read. The handwriting is difficult, but also the German is strange. But the letters are about family matters, but also descriptions of local events, and particularly they expressed a constant concern to provide their cousin Sebastian Schobinger in Switzerland with seltsame Sachen, with strange things. So Schobinger seems to have developed an interest in curiosities and antiquities. Jakob Christoph in Marseille acted as an intermediary and made sure that the objects which Ulrich found or acquired in Cairo found their way to St. Gallen. And among the curiosities that the Krums apparently sent to St. Gallen was, and we just know this because they are mentioned in the letters, we haven't seen them, but a couple of deer horns, and then rather upsettingly a small box with a child, a kleines Kästchen von einem Kind that has not properly been born, so I guess a mummy of a small child with its idol that has hieroglyphs written on it, and interestingly, a crocodile. So 6 shoes long, which Ulrich Krumm had apparently acquired in Cairo in 1619. This 4 meter long Nile crocodile, or I guess rather its skin, was shipped to St. Gallen, where it arrived after what seems to have been quite a long and protracted journey in 1623. It was stuffed there and then donated to the city library, and up to this day, it is exhibited at the Natural History Museum of St. Gallen as the oldest object of the collection. Now, you might wonder what this has all to do with the Quran in Europe. Well, there was another curious object that the Krums brought to St. Gallen, an object that plays quite an important and interesting role in the history of the Quran in early modern Europe. At around the same time, in the early 1620s, Schobinger was presented with an old Quran fragment written in Kufic script by his cousins, the Krums, who had purchased this manuscript in Cairo in 1620 and brought it back to St. Gallen and gifted it to their cousin. Now, the original is lost of this Kufic manuscript, but strangely, we are in possession of a number of facsimile copies that were produced of it in Europe in the later 17th and the 18th century. Here, a full copy of the fragment that we found in Groningen. Here, just one leaf to which I will return at the University Library the Royal Library in Copenhagen. Another few lines in a French treatise on the history of writing, and another full copy at the University Library in Kassel. Some of these copies, the one in Groningen and the one in Kassel, feature a Latin inscription by Sebastian Schobinger that informs us about the provenance of the manuscript, as well as the mysterious and marvelous aura that surrounded it. And this is quite a spectacular text, and I would like to quickly read it in an English translation. So it reads, "This fragment of a very old book, written in marvelous characters, was brought back from Cairo in Egypt to St. Gallen by my cousin Tobias Krumm. And with this, as with a very rare piece, he enriched my museum. And in my presence, he told me that there in Memphis, in Cairo, in a very venerable temple of the Turks, adorned with 600 columns of marble, there are still now many boxes full of such ancient books whose scripts nobody understands. It is commonly believed that these books have been preserved there since pharaonic times. This specimen has been given to him in return for a small gift by the guardian of this temple in 1620. If only someone would now act for us as a translator of such books, which probably contain, apart from sacred and ancient history, also the wisdom of the ancient Egyptians, which was once celebrated but has now become obsolete." So one central concern of our project is to offer an alternative to the traditional narrative that Christian European engagements with the Quran in the early modern period was solely polemical. The evidence we encounter, if you start looking beyond the trodden path, doesn't completely contradict this narrative. Obviously, polemical and anti-Islamic approaches are very frequent, but we do see a much greater variety of different forms of interaction and intellectual and cultural spaces that allowed for non-polemical engagements with the Quran too. Scholarship, for example, poetry, book cultures, and forms of curiosity and exotism, as you can see in this case. Undecipherable and old, this manuscript appeared as a mysterious object of greatest rarity, concealing ancient perennial knowledge, and as such was an ideal gift for an antiquarian collector of curious and exotic objects. And this collector, Sebastian Schobinger, indeed considered the manuscript a precious piece for his museum. Now, in the following minutes, I would like to follow the story of this Kufic manuscript and its European copies through the 17th century, at least in the first part of my talk. And I hope this will allow me to present you with some of the exciting problems we are dealing with in this project and some of the wonderful material that we have gathered from archives all over Europe so far. And obviously in this 30, 40 minutes, I can only present you with a small aspect of our research, but I hope with one that is representative of our work and our attempt to gain a broader picture of what early modern European Orientalism looked like. Copenhagen, where the team is based, has proven to be a surprisingly rich archive for our work. Just a couple of weeks ago, Paul Babinski and I, together with the librarian at the Royal Library, found boxes full of uncatalogued material with documents from Arabists like Reiske, Arpinius, Reland, and also a Latin translation of the Quran made by the German scholar Heinrich Sieke at around 1700, which had been thought to be lost since the mid-18th century. But the Royal Library in Copenhagen also hosts one of the earliest and richest European collection of Quran fragments in Kufic script. And it is interesting to see that most of the Kufic manuscripts that we have in Copenhagen were brought back to Europe at around the same time as the St. Gallen manuscript I was talking about in 1626 here, from the same place, Cairo, by a Danish-German traveler or merchant, Friedrich Buchwald. We don't know who that is, as you can see here. But we assume that these manuscripts in Copenhagen were all taken from the same deposit by the Amr Mosque in Al-Fusta, in Old Cairo, from where Westerners would spirit away old Quran manuscripts en masse in the following centuries. And like the Cairo St. Gallen manuscript, these Kufic manuscripts here in Copenhagen were also gifted. This time they were gifted to the Danish king and entered the king's Kunstkammer. And our research in the last 2 years has indeed shown that the Quran, as well as to a lesser degree other illuminated Islamic manuscripts, often functioned as precious gifts. They were collected and exhibited like exotic objects and could be found in museums or cabinets of curiosities. This is another astonishingly beautiful example of such a gift that ended up in the King's Kunstkammer, a Quran which the Danish Orientalist Theodor Petræus, always in search for support of his studies, gifted to the Danish king. And here another one, maybe more interesting example that we found among this uncatalogued material in Copenhagen, again a gift to Frederick III, but in this case, the manuscript was again tailor-made, and it is a quadrilingual version of Surat al-Fatiha in Arabic, with Persian and Turkish interlinear translations on the right-hand side, and on the other side, a Latin translation made by Petræus. And also maybe interesting is the reference here to a few lines from a poem by the poet Fusuli, as well as a reference to Psalm 25, 4-5, show me your ways, Lord, teach me your paths, which Petreius thought is kind of resonating, or is kind of an echo of Al-Fatih. Now, the copy of the Kufic manuscript from Cairo was gifted even twice. First, the original to the collector Schobinger, as we heard before, but also the facsimile copy was a gift, as we can see from the rest of the inscription. It was offered to the elector. It was offered in 1655 to the Elector Palatine in Heidelberg, Karl Ludwig I, or Charles Louis I, the ruler of the Calvinist stronghold in southern Germany. It was presented to Charles Louis by a new employee, the Zurich church historian and Orientalist Johann Heinrich Hottinger, who was commissioned to rebuild the Heidelberg Collegium Sapientiae after the devastation of the 30 Years' War. And among other hints, it is really this dedication here that tells us that it must have been Hottinger who had produced these facsimile, or this facsimile copy of the Kufic of Schobinger's Quran, Kufic Quran. Now, these, I think, are quite intriguing events. So we are here just at the end of the devastating 30 Years War, and see an Orthodox Zwinglian theologian produce a facsimile copy of a Quranic fragment and presenting it as a gift to a Calvinist, a German Calvinist ruler. However, in this case, this gift was not just a curious exotic object, but it had taken on additional or different meaning. For Hottinger, was one of the first European Orientalists of whom we know that he seemed to have managed to decipher the Kufic writing. He produced at the end, at the appendix of his facsimile copy in the Kassel manuscript, he produced an alphabet of Kufic letters, an alphabetum Kuficum, a key basically to decipher the script. And he also transcribed parts of the text into Nasr and translated it into Latin. So becoming readable, this manuscript obviously lost some of its mysterious aura and was now identified as a Quran, or the work of the arch heretic from a Christian perspective. But more than in the content, the Calvinist protagonists of this story were interested in the more material aspects of this fragment, or rather in the writing. In fact, the specific value of this document and the reason why Hottinger produced such a faithful facsimile copy was the fact that this represented a very rare piece of historical evidence that could testify to the history of writing in the East. And I have in my last talk that I gave at NYU shown in quite some detail how this specific Kufic manuscript that you see on the top, or that we saw before, was used as evidence in 17th and 18th century discussions about the history of the Hebrew script. It played a particular role in debates about the age and divinity of Hebrew vowel points, in the so-called vowel points controversy. Simply put, the question was really whether the vowel points in the Hebrew square script were late human additions going back to the Masoretes, or whether they were of antique divine origin. And although this controversy was not exclusively fought along confessional lines, it seems obvious that this was a pressing issue for Protestant biblical scholars who based their theology on scripture alone, right? The sola scriptura, as was their battle cry, and thus needed a stable text. Reformed scholars like Hottinger argued, based, among other things, on the material features of this Quran, that in Arabic calligraphy, vowel points were already set in oldest manuscripts. And you can see these vowel points and the diacritical signs here in this copy. And from this observation, they concluded that the same applied to Hebrew vowel points too. They were, such was the conclusion, of greatest antiquity, indeed of divine origin, and had always been part of the Hebrew square script since Mosaic times. But the use of this particular manuscript for the history of writing did not end here. At the end of the 17th century, we see it surfacing again between Frankfurt, Oxford, and Copenhagen. At Oxford in 1690, the astronomer and part-time Arabist Edward Bernard published a great chart illustrating the history of writing with all the alphabets of the world. And you can see that by this time, I hope you might not be able to see, but by this time, or in this particular scholarly circles, the vocalized Hebrew square script had been replaced by the much cruder Samaritan script as the contender for the first writing system, or as Bernard would call it, the alphabetum Adami, Noachi, Nini, Abrahami. So the alphabet of Adam and Abraham and Noah. And out of Samaritan, according to Bernard's chart, followed the Hebrew script, then Syriac, Arabic, Brahmanic, Greek, Latin, Coptic, Ethiopic, and Slavic scripts, or alphabets. And the introduction of vowel points into Syriac alphabet, Bernard dates to the year 306 after Christ, from where it then was introduced to Arabic at around 800, and then to Hebrew in 900. What you can see from here is that some dynamical and historical dimensions have been introduced here, and that the Hebrew square script is basically dethroned and been replaced by Samaritan. We'll come back to this in a second. Now, shortly after having published this chart, Bernard received mail from this gentleman, a German Ethiopist and advisor to the Duke of Saxon-Gotha, Hiob Ludolf. And in this letter that you can see on the right-hand side, Ludolf complimented Bernhard for his achievement, but he also criticized the missing of Kufik in Bernard's chart. Kufik, Ludolf argued, would represent an intermediate stage between Samaritan Hebrew on the one side and Arabic Nasr on the other. And Ludolf in his letter used the changing shape of the letter Nun as evidence for this development. Now, with this letter, to Bernard, Ludolf also sent a beautifully crafted specimen of Kufic writing. And you can see that this is yet another copy of this Cairo, St. Gallen, Kassel manuscript that we talked about at the beginning. And just in parentheses, this in a re-edition of Bernard's chart from 1759, you see now the Kufic alphabet was introduced. It was included here on the margins here, by the Laudian professor of Arabic Thomas Hunt at the time. But where did Ludolf get his Kufic text from? It appears that he had been sent the copy from the Kassel library that we looked at before, just the year before in 1689, and was asked to write a report on it for the librarian, who didn't know what to make of it. And Ludolf again made copies of this copy, and transcribed and translated part of it, and these copies and transcriptions are now in Frankfurt. And he was probably able to transcribe it and to read the text because he could use the alphabetum Kuficum, the key that his predecessor Hottinger had produced a few years before. We know this because we found in one of Ludolf's book a copy of this key, and that he probably used himself at the British Library. Now, what is interesting is that Ludolf sent this key to the Kufic alphabet to some of his correspondents in the Protestant Republic of Letters, not just to Bernard in Oxford, but for instance also to the Breslau scholar Andreas Akolutus, who copied the key into his handbook. You can see it here, which is now at the library in Dresden. Now, let me stop here quickly for a moment and draw some conclusions or some slightly disjointed observations but I think a quite important one. So we could continue discussing numerous examples of European Orientalists copying Arabic, Turkish, and Persian manuscripts. We found numerous European copies, not only of the Quran, but also of other sources in archives, which reflect the fact that European scholars had to learn the skills necessary to deal with with Turkish, Arabic, and Persian manuscripts. And I'll just show you a selection of Quran copies that we found. Here, one in Marburg from the mid-17th century, another one from the earlier 17th century in Groningen. Here, one that we found at the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek München, also from the 17th century. And in the shadow of the achievements of early modern European printing culture, it is often forgotten that, like the contexts in Aleppo or Istanbul, Orientalists in Europe learned in a world of manuscripts. They read with pen in hand, annotated manuscripts in their libraries, learned to decipher different handwritings and calligraphies, and to master the art of copying manuscripts quickly and reliably. Or they had to hire scribes and scrollers from the East. The history of early modern European Oriental studies is to a great extent the history of Oriental calligraphy, paleography, and codicology in a European setting. And secondly, from a sociological perspective, or a microhistory of knowledge production and diffusion, maybe better, we see here a Protestant network of communications stretching from Cairo to Calvinist Switzerland, Lutheran Germany, and England, through which these copies of a Kufi Quran, together with the key of how to read it, were distributed. And this created a small knowledge community and enabled scholars within this community to read and to productively use these documents in scholarly, historical, but also theological debates. And we can maybe see the significance of this when we look at scholars or places that were excluded from this Protestant network. For instance, the French Catholic Orientalist Etienne Fourmont, a professor of Arabic at the Collège de France since 1715. Between 1730 and 1734, Fourmont received some 4 folios of 2 of the Kufi manuscripts held at the Royal Library in Copenhagen, which we mentioned before. And they were sent to him by the French ambassador to Denmark. And Fourmont too produced copies of these leaves, which are now at the Bibliothèque Nationale. And you can see them here. So here's the original on the one side here, and then here the copy in the Bibliothèque Nationale made by Fourmont. Here an interesting one because it shows kind of an intermediary and an earlier production stage that is not yet finished. And here the fourth. And he also wrote a short memoir sur les 4 feuilles des manuscrits de Copenhagen, so a short report on these manuscripts. Now, while the Bibliothèque du Roi, or the Bibliothèque Nationale, since Napoleon's invasion in Egypt, has one of the greatest collections of Kufic manuscripts in Europe, at the time, it had none whatsoever. So Fourmont recognized the calligraphy in these manuscripts as Kufic because he had seen titles and inscriptions on coins written in Kufic. But he was apparently not able to decipher the text or to identify the leaves as part of Quran manuscripts. And even more intriguing, and most probably an echo of the 17th century debate about the antiquity of vowel points in Hebrew and Arabic, is Fourmont's claim that the red dots and the red dots above and below the black letters, which are clearly indications of vowels, are ad ornamentum solum, so just for ornamental sake, and that proper vowel points and diacritical signs were missing in Kufic script. Now, I don't want to overemphasize the confessional dimension of this development, but it is an aspect that interests us a lot, and it seems clear from our research that we have developments, scholarly tradition, and practices of European Oriental scholarship that are shared and passed on within regional or confessional borders. which leads me to the third point I want to highlight, and also to the last part of my presentation. This very brief spotlight on the debate about the history of writing that I presented shows a shift within Oriental philology from a theological to a more cultural approach over the 17th century, and the role that comparative Oriental studies played in this development. The shifting assessment of the Hebrew square script from a divine primordial alphabet to a mere historical step in the development of writing between Samaritan, Syriac, and Arabic is paradigmatic. Orthodox Protestant scholars on the height of the confessional debate in the early 17th century defend the absolute primacy and divinity of Hebrew script, as well as of the Hebrew language and the truth of the biblical texts. But they would do this more and more with the help of Arabic and other related languages and sources. The Protestant sola scriptura approach to the Bible was a powerful driver for the development of Oriental philology and Arabic learning in Northern Europe. Arabic was often conceived to be almost identical with Hebrew and could thus help unlock some of the linguistic secrets of the Hebrew texts of the Bible. But Oriental and comparative philology would eventually also undermine this privileged position of Hebrew and of the Hebrew Bible. So I think it is fair to say that there is a continuous and widespread academic engagement with classical Arabic and with the Quran in the Protestant parts of Europe that we do not see in the Catholic world in the 17th century in that way. And this engagement had major scholarly as well as theological and cultural ramifications. Our research has shown that in the deepest provinces of Germany, of Lutheran Germany, in small towns like Zwickau, Braunschweig, Rostock, etc., instructions of Arabic were included in the curricula of institutions of higher learning or pursued privately. And there is plenty of evidence that shows that the central role that the Quran played in the learning and teaching of Arabic all over the Protestant world. Now, there are different reasons for this. The rather wide availability of the Quran is certainly one, but also, and more importantly, the fact that Protestants didn't want to study, say, spoken Arabic like the missionaries would want, like Roman missionaries would want to do, but they were looking for a linguistic standard or a linguistic archive. And the Quran was conceived to be exactly that, the grammatical norm and standard of Arabic. No book is more convenient for inexperienced beginners, wrote Theodore Bibliander in his 1543 edition of Robert of Ketten's medieval Latin translation of the Quran, than the Quran, because of the ease in reading, since it includes the vowels and other additions to the letters that are lacking in other books, and because it observes Arabic grammar. Just as in the Hebrew language, no book is more appropriate for learners than the Bible. It would be most useful for those learning the Arabic language to use the Latin interpretation or translation for the Arabic book, even if the teacher is learned and trustworthy. So here we see Wilhelm Schickard, a professor of Hebrew at Tübingen University in around 1620, following this advice and using Bibliander's Latin Quran edition next to a looted fragment of the Quran. And you can see how Schickard or someone else who worked with this manuscript tried to connect the Latin translation with and the verses here, which are numbered, with the verses in the Arabic text. And this seems to have been the method which was followed by the very pioneers of Northern European Arabic studies, as they would try to get a grip on the difficult language. And this in a time where there was no grammar or dictionary available. But the problem here was that Ketten's translation was by no means a literal translation, but rather a free paraphrase. So it was very difficult to connect the Latin text with the Arabic text. And here you can see another example, again in Schickard's, by Wilhelm Schickard, where he does exactly the same. Another problem was that the Latin translation by Ketten had a different surah count. So it counted 124 surahs rather than 114. And to help with this, Schickard put together an index that relates Ketten's surah count to the classical count. At around this time, a first textbook for students of Arabic was published that remedied some of these issues. In 1617, Thomas Epinius, who is also the author of a groundbreaking Latin grammar of Arabic, published in Leiden his Surat Yusuf, his edition of Surat Yusuf. And this specimen was clearly tailored for instruction in the classroom, as you can see, with an interlinear word-by-word translation, and a much freer and more elegant Latin translation in the margins, and with grammatical explanations in the appendix. This specimen inaugurated a peculiar genre, which again we only find in Northern Europe, Quran specimena, for teaching purposes, of which numerous examples were printed throughout the 17th century, often with rudimental typographical means, like this one, like this edition of Surat al-Saf by Johann Zechendorf in Zwickau. Many copies of these specimena that we find carry traces of their often intense uses by students of Arabic all over Europe. Here, the hand of Hiob Ludolf in Frankfurt, whom we already met, annotating the edition of Surat al-Rum by Matthias Friedrich Beck in 1688. And you can see that here, rather than using a clumsy Arabic type, we use Hebrew types to print the Arabic. Here, a heavily annotated personal copy of the edition of Surat Yusuf by of Johann Kamann, a jurist and governmental official in Braunschweig. The copy and the annotations are testimony to Kamann's attempt to learn Arabic privately in Braunschweig, of all places, in the early 17th century. So this random collection can give you an idea of the wide dissemination of admittedly often rudimentary attempts to learn Arabic with the Quran in Lutheran Germany in the 17th century. At the end of the century, a new tool for teaching and learning Arabic was printed in Hamburg, Abraham Hinkelmann's edition of the Arabic Quran in 1694. Here again, we find copies with annotations indicating its private and institutional use, and quite spectacular is this copy here, which we found in the Nachlass of Oluf Gerhard Tüxen in Rostock. Our hypothesis at the moment is that we have here probably about 3 different hands, as well as two or three different sources to which the annotations refer. Some of the references are to Ludovico Maracci's translation that came just out at the same time, but the students of Arabic in Halle, where most of these annotations were done, had another source at their hands in those years. Many of these interlinear glosses, namely the red ones, seem to refer to the teaching of 2 itinerant Syrian Christians, Salomon Negri, as he's called in Latin, Suleiman bin Yaqub al-Shami al-Sarehani, and Shukral al-Dadiki, or Carolus Rali Dadiki, who two Syrian Christians who spent time in Halle between 1715 and 1719, and who taught Arabic to students at Halle, again with the Quran. And we know this because in the archive of Tixen we also found a translation of the entire Quran that seems to go back to the teaching of these two Syrians, and the red annotations here, they correspond with this translation. The fact, in any case, that even in the pietist stronghold of Halle, in the teaching of 2 Eastern Christians, the Quran played a central role is again remarkable. If we remember again that Arabic in almost all these cases was learned in view of a better understanding of the Hebrew texts of the Old Testament, then I think this is even more noteworthy. The privileged role that the Quran has taken in the history of Protestant Arabic philology as the norm of the Arabic language and as a prime textbook for learning and teaching underpins, I believe, an epistemological shift in the traditional relationship of Quran and Bible, as well as of Arabic and Hebrew, which we can observe at the turn to the 18th century. And this change of perspective can beautifully be illustrated by the work of another student at the Collegium Orientale Theologicum in Halle, who has also attended Arabic classes with Salomon Negri. And so I come to the very last part of my presentation. Christian Benedict Michaelis, the father of the more famous Johann David Michaelis, tried to illustrate in a number of dissertations published around 1739, natural, cultural, and ritual occurrences in the Hebrew Bible with parallel passages of the Quran. And he argued the Arabs, who are of the same blood as the Hebrews and share a common ancestor in Abraham, have a lot in common with them, be it in language, as well as in manners and customs. I have collected traces of their similarities in the Quran and collated them with biblical texts, because the cult and rituals of the Hebrews and the sacred expressions can often be better interpreted through the Quran than through Greek or Latin authorities, be them historical or poetical. Michaelis' interpretation of the Hebrew Bible through the Quran is only one example of a much broader phenomenon. We could also refer to the work of Samuel Boschar, in which the Quran is frequently used to explain natural and geographical occurrences in the Bible, or to the arguments of the Genevan biblical scholar Jean Leclerc, who tries to understand the aesthetical value of biblical poetry through comparison with the style of the Quran and its frequent use of parallelism and end rhyme. And to the work of the Leiden Hebrew scholar Albert Schultens, who championed the reading of biblical Hebrew through Quranic Arabic at the beginning of the 18th century. This change of the relationship between Quran and Bible reflects a development that transformed Oriental and biblical studies in Protestant Europe in the late 17th and 18th century. At the glance, the method used in Christian Benedict Michaelis' dissertation shows the beginning of what transformed the Bible, in the words of Jonathan Sheehan, from a work of theology to a work of culture. In lockstep, a similar process happened to the Quran in Western scholarship too, as I've tried to show in a piece written with Alex Bevilacqua a couple of years ago. The Quran too was transformed in many readings from a work of heresy that had to be refuted and dismantled to a text that became part and parcel of a cultural, historical, and linguistic landscape to which also the texts of the Old Testament belong. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Loop. Again, I want to remind those who are attending that if you have any questions or comments, please write them on the chat. So we'll start as we wait for more questions. Fascinating about the Protestant network, the knowledge community that developed around the Quran. My question is really, I want to understand more, or if you could elaborate a bit more about the context. I mean, can you contextualize their work? Was it also uniquely done to understand the Hebrew Bible? Was this the only goal they had? And did their collective work develop into some kind of a corpus?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think, yeah, so as I tried to show, I think the main driver was really Hebrew studies, basically. So in this, and that's why I was, and this was really a concern that was at the center of Protestantism, right? So because they wanted to they went back to the original sources of the Hebrew Bible and had to understand the Hebrew texts, which are often only, you only have the Hebrew text of the Bible. That's the only kind of corpus you have, right? So, and there are many kind of words, expressions, difficult constructions that they wouldn't understand. So, in the wake of this kind of this development of Hebrew studies in the 16th and 17th century, the idea developed that actually we could use Arabic as a very closely related language, that would open the doors to, and so comparative Semitical studies basically develop in this time, and the Quran, but not just the Quran. I mean, the Quran I focused on the Quran here in this talk, but also classical Arabic poetry, for example, was seen as an archive, as a linguistic archive of the Hebrew language, basically, right? So so that was a very important driver. And what I wanted to kind of underline here is that this concept of a classical language, rather than, for example, like we have a completely different development in Rome, for example, where the education of missionary was much more important, where there was much greater focus on also spoken languages and possibility to interact with people and to kind of missionarize. So I think following that, I think we have a development of a corpus that consists mainly of selected poetical texts. Al-Hariri, for example, is very early on an important text, but also Al-Mutanabi and others, as well as the Quran. The Quran features in almost all grammars from the 17th century as a teaching, as a reading text, as a tool.
Thank you, Jan. So we have a question from Professor Pomerantz. Saying, I'm reading the question, thanks so much for this fascinating lecture. Would you then say that this Protestant cultural Quran opened the door to the study of Arabic poetry, literature more broadly? I know the rise of study of Amthal, proverbs, were also very important for these early Orientalists as well.
Absolutely. I think that this is really the in Europe. The study of Arabic poetry starts in these Protestant circles, and is driven also by very particular concepts of what Arabic poetry actually is, and by the idea that actually it is in Arabic poetry that the original semantic qualities and the original meaning of Semitical words and roots that you can find in Hebrew is actually preserved. That it was kind of so really literally kind of Arabic poetry was conceived as a storage or as an archive, and I believe that this is also a concept that was taken over from Arabic concepts and theories about poetry, and that they come into 17th and early 18th century Oriental studies. And you have someone like the Leiden Hebrew scholar Albert Schultens, whom I mentioned, who argues Arabic and Hebrew are basically the same languages. The problem is just Hebrew is kind of a dead language, and there's often also so kind of an anti-Semitic drive. So basically, Hebrew is a dead language, which is we need to go back to Arabic, which is much where we have a much bigger corpus of where we can really reconstruct the meaning of the Hebrew text via Arabic poetry. And he was the first who edited Al-Hariri, or at least some maqamat, and that is actually really indeed I would say the beginning of Protestant interest in Arabic poetry.
There is no, well, let me then ask one maybe last question, because I don't see more questions in the Q&A or chat, about the text that they were using to teach Arabic language. So Surat Yusuf, certainly, it's And it's interesting that actually, you know, it's so the idea that actually it's a very good, you know, sort of chapter to teach Arabic. What others, you know, what other chapters from the Quran are somehow used to teach the language as you know, as a class, you know, as a course to give to
I mean,
beginners,
like,
maybe, or something.
Yeah, no, I think it's actually quite random. I mean, obviously they wouldn't use, they wouldn't lose long Surat al-Baqarah because it's too long. So they would actually choose ones that were rather short. And I think we saw before that was Zechendorf edited Surat al-Saf. I think Beck edited Surat al-Rum. So I think the main decision was like kind of length, right? That was the main driver. Sometimes it is also of course texts that have some relations to biblical stories that were in there. Obviously that's the great Surat Yusuf. That was an important element. But what is interesting, whereas in kind of in a medieval context, this would be always then also a moment of a moment for kind of polemical comparisons, and wherever the Quran kind of deviates from a biblical narrative, you would have like a kind of a polemical engagement. And these teaching texts are completely void. There's of any polemical interaction. They're completely kind of reduced to grammatical or linguistic questions, which I found is fascinating, and is one of these cultural spaces that I mentioned, that I thought were opened, where kind of a non-polemical engagement was possible.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor Luke. This was really a fascinating and beautifully illustrated lecture. I wish you all the best on this and on your general project, which is a great project, really. And I thank all those who have attended this talk, and I am sure that the program will be organizing other such very interesting and important lectures. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.